Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Bible and Archaeology podcast. I'm Jordan Jones, as usual, here with Dr. Bob Cargill. And today we have a special guest coming back that we are very happy to have once again.
Yeah, we're happy to welcome here an old friend who's been here before, Professor Cooney. This is Professor of Egyptian Art and Architecture and Chair of the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures at UCLA, and author of The Good Kings, with a chapter, an entire chapter dedicated to the topic of our conversation today, the Pharaoh Akhenaten. Welcome back, Cooney.
Thanks so much for having me on, Bob. Thanks, Jordan. This is always fun, so I'm happy to be back.
Well, we always like to pick your brain when we can about Akhenaten, and thanks for taking the time. We're going to ask you some questions, just basic questions at the beginning for our audience. Some people have heard the name Akhenaten. They've probably heard him from Ancient Aliens. They've heard him from movies. But we want to learn about this pharaoh, who he was, when he reigned, what he did, and then of course our audience is going to want to learn how it ties in, if at all, to anything having to do with the Bible. So let's start at the top. Who was this guy? Who was Pharaoh Akhenaten?
Well, it seems he was at least the second son of King Amenhotep III, not the first son. And that means that he wasn't the heir, and he wasn't meant to rule in his mind. It's so difficult talking about these ancient Egyptian kings because we know so much about what they did, what they built, but we know so little about what they thought and what they felt. And that's the way authoritarianism works. They present you with the ideal story, but then most Egyptologists don't do this. They're not crazy enough to do this. But I then try to look behind what the official rhetoric is and try to understand, well, what the hell was this guy thinking, and how might he have found himself in this position? And it helps me to see that he was a second son rather than a first son, because we all know from our own families that the first child is the alpha and runs things in a certain way and has expectations from their parents that the middle children do not have. I'm a middle child and hence an Egyptologist, because why? But Akhenaten's a middle child and a religious zealot. So okay, those things jive for me. A royal nursery is a different kind of place. There probably would have been a whole ton of middle children. But when you're talking about adults who are readying themselves for rule after the very long reign of their father, Amenhotep III, if the heir dies, it's going to cause all kinds of trauma and drama and everyone positioning themselves. And it seems that Amenhotep IV, because we really should call him Amenhotep IV at the beginning of his reign. That was his name after his father. Amenhotep IV then suddenly slides into this position in Memphis, Heliopolis, and his hometown of Thebes. I say hometown because that's where the dynasty is from, though they probably didn't spend as much time there. And then he got busy. He got busy with all kinds of unusual and strange building projects that show a different religion than anything, a religious ritual system than anything we had seen before, in praying to a god by the name of Aten, whom we had seen before, a sun god, the visible god in the sky, and then moved the capital and disallowed the cults of other gods to such an extent that we Egyptologists argue quite brutally with one another about whether or not we should call him a monotheist. So we're talking about this king who may have introduced monotheism to the world. What does that mean? What was it like? And so there's so much to talk about with Akhenaten.
I think that's a great, for anyone coming in saying, I've either never heard this name, or for some people, they've heard this name maybe down different TikTok conspiracy lanes. I think that's a great stage setting for all the places that we're going to go. And I want to cycle back to this naming change that you mentioned here, that originally we know him by the name most commonly as Akhenaten, but that wasn't his first name that he comes in as. Can you discuss that shift and how common that might be, or how we should be understanding that in this, maybe not the original heir here? Does that play in, or how do we need to think about that name change?
Such a name change is unique. It is unprecedented. And you could say, well, wait a minute, Hatshepsut added united with Amen to her birth name. Okay, great, good for you. But to actually change your birth name to something completely different is bizarre, unprecedented, and strange. And to then change it to something that is honoring your chosen divinity is interesting. But then something that removes the element that identifies you with your father and identifies you with your lineage is super strange. Because when, let's say, Hillary Clinton had been elected, and she's not going to remove the name Clinton. That's the reason she would have been elected, right? It's also the reason she wasn't elected. Interesting. So these lineages have a weight. They have baggage associated with it. And for whatever reason, Akhenaten, as we now call him, felt that the Amen element of his name and the name Amenhotep itself had so much baggage associated with it that he needed to jettison it entirely. And the reasons for that they're really not clear. Did his father step too far? I mean, his father was all about parties and building and destroying things so he could build things again, and perhaps some wasteful spending, a lot of lavish living, right? And Akhenaten is like, apparently, I don't want to be associated with anything that my father is doing, while at the same time he's divinizing his father. It's very confusing, very confusing issues. And some Egyptologists have laid all of this at the ground of some sort of psychological trauma. And I'm not going to do that. I like to be very political with these things. And yes, rulers, kings are able to bring their psychoses and mental health issues into their throne rooms. They do, and they can. And we know as historians that this happens. But one way that Egyptologists do look at this is to see that his name change is moving away from the cult of Amen, which is a southern Theban stronghold with a whole lot of money, a whole lot of wealth, and moving towards a cult that is fresh and new, that he is building from the ground up, so that he can pull those funds into something that he has complete control over. Mm-hmm. And it is very useful to take that cynical lens, and instead of seeing it as purely religiously driven, though that may have been part of his agenda, it is also economically driven. It is also politically driven. And he is moving away from an institution, the Amen cult, the Amen priesthood, that he cannot control. He can't get in there and be like, do what I say. They're like, dude, we've been doing this for my Lord, they would say. We have been doing this for millennia, my Lord. Maybe it's not true millennia, hundreds of years certain. It has always been done this way, and the king can't go in and change it. But changing the cult and moving the funds, then he has ultimate power. And there's a whole lot of dominoes that fall. But the name change would have happened within the first 5 years. And it would have been just shocking to the courtiers, the elites, the priests, as they go, wait, what happened? And what's going on? And maybe a different set of priests from the Amen priesthood or Heliopolitan Atum priesthood or Memphite Ptah priesthood would have run this name change. He's also empowering an Aten priesthood, which is unprecedented as well.
This is fascinating to me, and I again, I don't deliberately want to draw biblical parallels or parallels to ancient Israel.
Oh, but you can and you should.
But I will on this one, but it's not the one that people are going to expect. When King Hezekiah comes to reign in the late 8th century, one of the first things he does is this religious reform.
Yeah. In
part because he wants to rebel. The Bible even says he's going to rebel against his Neo-Assyrian overlords. But what does he do? You know, it comes off looking like religious reforms, right?
Yeah.
He's in the beginning of 2 Kings 18, he's going to get rid of all of the other shrines to the Hebrew deity, to Yahweh, and he's going to focus all worship on the temple in Jerusalem. And many people say this as, oh, he's getting rid of all this, worship to the Baals and the Asherahs, but he's also getting rid of all of the worship that was done to Yahweh, to the Hebrew deity, including to the high places that had been set up, to these standing stones that Jacob had set up, right? And this Nehushtan, this bronze serpent that is supposedly Moses had set up in the desert that they were still worshiping. And people say, oh, look, he's purifying the religion. He's making it a true monotheistic religion. But I would argue what he's actually doing is consolidating power around himself and around the cult in Jerusalem so that he has complete control, so that all funds, all power, all influence comes to Jerusalem, so that it's not just a religious reform, but it's a political reform that consolidates power around Hezekiah. And what you're describing, it sounds like he's doing the same thing. If he can create a new cult, if he can create a new priesthood that is basically dependent upon him, then that gives him that much more power. And if he is planning a rebellion against Assyria, that would be one of the first steps that you'd take.
Yeah. And I go far in my chapter in the Good Kings and in that book, and I link monotheism specifically to political centralization, to you're either with me or you're against me. And it made me, writing that chapter and looking at this from a political economic lens, made me rethink monotheism from a political perspective, in that its creation, particularly in Egypt, but arguably in the Levant as well, is as much political as it is religious, because it works so well short-term, especially short-term, for the leader to say, you have to believe in the way that I believe, or you're not in my inner circle, and I can easily expunge you. I can move you to the side because you are now a heretic. And you create this idea of something that doesn't fit with what is ideal. And this monotheism that we dance around and we talk about, that Akhenaten, I believe, did do, is a centralization of political and economic power, but it is veiled with religious power. And I'm always looking back to this sociologist by the name of Michael Mann, who tells us there are 4 different types of power: ideological, economic, military, and political. And that ideological power is arguably the most powerful because it cannot be proven nor disproven. And that power, social power, if you show it and you say, okay, everyone, look at how powerful I am. Look at how I have all the money and all the army and you can't. You have to hide that power. You have to hide your light under a bushel. You can't be like, check out all my power. It needs to be power with a soft P, and it needs to be power wielded in a way that God needs you to do it, however that, or gods, however that is understood. Right. And you're only doing what is meant to be. If it's all a selfish power play, then people will take you down. So you have to bring in the ideological to make a big move like this, and to move an entire institution out of your sphere of influence. This is a brilliant way of doing it. Whether people knew they were doing that when they were doing it is the arguable point, because we people work in social systems and we believe fervently in a lot of different religious ideas. That doesn't mean that Akhenaten is a cynic who's going through this saying, I need to move the Amen priesthood to the side, so I will create this new religion. No, he probably was like, this Amen priesthood is driving me crazy. I also happen to believe in this other cult more fervently, and then sees over time that moving his attention and an investment towards that cult gives him more power vis-a-vis the Amen priesthood, then he's going to make some big moves. And those two things can be true at the same time.
Could you flesh out some of the ways as he's making these moves for the people that are looking to try to understand how exactly does this take place? What are some of those big movements that he undertakes to reshape the way this is going, and how that might present that stark reaction to some of the people that are experiencing this, like you mentioned with the name change?
So much of our story comes from Thebes, modern day Luxor, which is very frustrating because it's really not where the conversation in the room was happening, right? The power centers of Egypt were always at the apex of the Delta and the Nile. That would be near modern day Cairo and Heliopolis or Memphis. And he arguably started there, but it seems that his reaction against the Amen priesthood was more deeply felt in Thebes, because that's the cult of Amen. That's its home, right? So we have more evidence for the iconoclasm, the removal of the god Amen's name in Thebes. We have more evidence of his Sed festival. I'll explain that in a minute. in Thebes. But what he does in all three of these centers of power is he builds new cult centers to the Aten alongside the pre-existing cult centers. So at the Temple of Ptah in Memphis, he builds an Aten cult center. Same with the sun god Atum at Heliopolis, and of course in Eastern Karnak, generally on the eastern side. Eastern Karnak in Thebes. And these cult centers are very different from what you had seen before. So he comes in with his new name change, and he comes in with a new self-representation. And let's like try to think of it in modern terms. It would be like if the president that we have, President Biden, this is our president, right? If Biden suddenly started to have himself depicted, let's say Biden went out and got super Botoxed and plastic surgery and all of a sudden had a brand new face and then started to depict that brand new face everywhere. And the face looked very strange and otherworldly, but he looked powerful. It looked different. People couldn't stop talking about it. Now, we have presidents who are shown, we have leaders around the world who are shown in moving film pictures, moving video pictures, and we can see them in real time. But you have to imagine you live in Egypt where you don't have that, where a limited number of elites have access to their king to see him in the flesh. Most other people are seeing depictions of him, and that's it. He decides, and it's got to be him in council with a few high elites who have these ideas as well. But he decides, I need to look different, not just a little different. I need to look really, really
very
different. Very different. So he's like, okay, name change. And that goes with a new visage that shows his face and body, but his face in particular pulled and extended, vertically. He has slit-like eyes that are long and set oblique in the face. He's got this incredibly long nose that leads into nasolabial folds that go down deeply cut into his cheeks. He's got a chin that's so protuberant, it looks just bizarre. And if you look at his statuary from the side, it looks prognathic. It sticks out. It looks like a horse or some sort of animal, a lion, really. And he's got, so I hope everyone is Googling images of Akhenaten as we speak. His body also is very bizarre. So he stretches his body and he's got these very thin arms and thin ankles and wrists. His hands are very long. His neck is extraordinarily long. The artists who were meant to draw him in relief had to add an extra grid square because his neck was so long. He messes with the idea of gender. And most of his images show him with breasts of some kind. He has a protuberant belly, very much like the Egyptian hermaphroditic god Hapi, that shows him that god is male and female at the same time. And Akhenaten is playing with that. He has giant hips, feminine-like hips. And his legs, I mean, I hope people are Googling this. Look at his legs. They're like a chicken drumstick. His thighs are like this broad thing that then narrows down into this little knee. And then he's got these very long but slender calves. And it's just a bizarre image that Egyptologists have looked at and argued with one another what disease Akhenaten could possibly have. And the ancient aliens people are like, well, he's definitely an alien. And, yes, and then I come in with some, gotta be. And then I come in with some different analysis of this figure. But in year 5, he comes in, he's like, I need to look different. I need to be different. I need to have a different name. I need to be in different temples. I need a different wife. So whatever wife he had in years 1 through 4, we don't know. Was it a sister, a half sister? Was it some other chick? We have no idea. And he brings in this Nefertiti. Was that her original name? Almost certainly not. Her name means the beautiful one has come. And he's engineering this whole new family system for himself. He institutes his wife as a ritualist alongside him. And he moves everything into the direction of worshiping no god or goddess that takes on human form, but a god who is the visible sun in the sky. And everyone calls it the Aten sun disk, and I take issue with that because when it's in relief, you actually see a convexity to this round solar image. I'm almost positive the Egyptians knew it was a globe. They knew it was round, and in relief, they depict it as such. But the Aten is the visible sun in the sky, and Akhenaten is like, his name means I am the one who is beneficial to him. I'm the only one, and my wife, who are beneficial to him, who can talk to him, touch him. And his imagery, the way he's depicting his body, I think, is the way he would have depicted himself to his people in his window of appearances, with the sunlight shining right on him. So imagine how a human figure is distorted and changed when light is shining behind them. Think of a backlit figure. For those of us old enough, you can think of Close Encounters of the Third Kind, when the aliens come out of the spaceship and they all look weird and stretched. And then he gets to know them. Richard Dreyfuss runs into the spaceship and he's like, oh, they're just little people like me. But he's showing himself as otherworldly. He's showing himself as a being of light. He doesn't have Marfan syndrome. He's not a hermaphrodite. He doesn't have Furlick syndrome. Egyptologists have gone down all of these paths, and there's no way of really proving them true or false, though we may have a mummy. But if we do have a mummy, it shows none of these things. Right. And he's showing himself as the son of God, which the Egyptians had done before, but of a particular God, of the son of light in the sky. And that is why he's showing himself in this way. And his wife takes the same weird proportions in face and body that he does, all stretched out. And so it's just bizarro land. And it's so much fun to study. And really, Egyptologists have so many different opinions on this time period that it's pretty contentious pretty quick. And I'm there for that.
With all of this rebranding that he's doing and the building of temples, I think most people associate him with the move to Amarna. But there is this phasing of rebranding that's happening before that.
Yeah.
Why do that and then decide to move? If you're doing all this rebranding, why not stay? Is there something about it that's unsuccessful that requires a shift in location?
It seems so. And that's why his boundary stela are so important. The boundary stela are really broken. They're not complete texts at all. But it seems that by year 5, after his said festival of kingly renewal, a said festival is supposed to happen after 30 years, we think, but he celebrates one for the Aten as a king. So he can do whatever he wants, right? He's making the rules. And the said festival is really for him and his wife, but it's for the Aten as he's presenting it. And it's Don Redford who said this wonderful thing that, and I'm paraphrasing, that Akhenaten raises the level of kingship and lowers the level of divinity, so that he is co-equal with that divinity. And he is the only representative of divinity in anthropomorphic form. Every other image of divinity is inaccessible and far away. But your question is, why then make all of these changes and then go off to this new uncharted territory and create a new capital? And he does this by year 5. It's also somewhat gradual, 4 to 5 to 6, and then boom, we're done. We're at Amarna and we're living at a construction site. And he tells us that it's because Aten needs him to do this. Any king is going to do this. In the same way that Hatshepsut is like, I am only a female king because the god Amun-Re told me I had to do this. It's not me. I'm not taking the power. He asked me to do it. Okay, fine. So power must be hidden, right? You can't make it all about you. So Aten told him to do it. But then we, as the historians of authoritarianism, can look behind that idealizing religious lens and say, well, he obviously couldn't manifest his vision, his political and economic vision, in the old strongholds of Memphis and Heliopolis and Thebes, and felt that he needed to get out. He needed a clean slate. And this is part of what monotheism is. Monotheism is centralizing power within the ideology. And Akhenaten, at the same time, it's beautiful to see, is centralizing power geographically. He's centralizing power within the cult. But to centralize power geographically, and I do compare it to many new capitals around the world. You could think of Louis XIV and Versailles. You could think of Brasilia. You could think of Washington, D.C. Any of these purpose-built capitals are meant to be like, Philadelphia is too difficult. I can't get in there. Richmond is too difficult. All those Southerners can't get in there. But if we build this new capital in Washington, D.C. in swampland, then everyone has to live in swampland and figure it out together. And everyone is on a back foot. And so it seems that Akhenaten is doing that to his elites. And it's a huge ask for his elites. Are you going to come with me? Or are you going to stay behind? Where is your loyalty? Is it with me in this capital? where you have to live in a construction site and you have to help me build it and you have to work hard and live in your tent? Or and you have to think of those real situations. Or are you going to be all comfy cozy in your villa that you've had for generations in Thebes or Memphis or Heliopolis? Which is it going to be? And it seems that this shift to the new capital allows him to see who's with him or against him. And it allows him to build a new elite very quickly from a military class of men. And those are his most loyal subjects who are going to do whatever it is that he needs. It is a clean slate religiously. It is a clean slate in terms of his identity and his name. It is a clean slate in terms of his wife and the creation of children. And it is a clean slate in terms of location and palace and temple. And it becomes a clean slate in terms of his lieutenants. So it's all about power. And yet we look at it and make it all about religion or the weird way he looks, because that's all we can see.
No, that is true about all things, right? You can't expect the old machine to make new things. Sometimes you just gotta leave the old machine behind and develop or create something new of your own. And if you're king, you can do that, right? It's at least it's much easier to do that. The question is how successful are you going to be and how long is it going to last? And this is one of the questions is, how long is this legacy going to last? And how much success did he actually have in developing this?
I mean, Bob, it's such an interesting thing. You're like, if you're king, you can do it. And you come from Levantine land where the king is usually bad in the eyes of the Lord. Right. Right?
Yeah, no, it is.
Yeah.
Even when they're proclaimed good, they're usually bad. Right?
Yeah. So the king is, and this is an important instruction for everyone listening as we stare down the gun of authoritarianism in the United States, or you're thinking about what power and rule means, that no one man can go into a political institution or set of institutions and do whatever the hell he wants. Right. There are social rules. There's always going to be pushback. A king is always going to rely on his elites and the elites rely on him. There's always a balance of power. And this episode of history teaches us that even the Egyptian king, who is that divine monarch, the hawk, the Horus hawk, who is personified, this king that even children could be king on the throne, where anywhere in the world they would be killed before a month was out, right? Even this divine king could not manifest in the way that he wanted and decided to scorch earth and move out and just start again. But you get an idea that most kings in Egypt are probably quite dissatisfied with what they were able to do with the position that they were in, and that the position that they were in was arguably much more about being seen and doing this ritual endlessly rather than being in the room where it happens and making the realpolitik decisions. And Akhenaten wanted to be able to make these decisions. And so he created a religious reason in a very religiously driven place where he could do it. Yeah. The connections to the Levantine situation are wonderful, I think. They really work.
And do you think this is one of the reasons why people try to draw clearly, politically, there's always powers, because when you're dealing with political machines, when you're dealing with a monarchy, or when you can draw sociological parallels, you can draw political parallels. But do you think this is why so many people try to draw, let's just say openly, religious parallels between, the Israelites got the idea of monotheism from the Egyptians, or, they got this idea of, during the Exodus or whatever. Do you think that that's where it came from, or was it more of a systems driven memory of these things, or they had access to the archives or something?
I'm going to say yes and yes, right?
You're a scholar. You have to.
Because we have Psalm 104. It is 104, right? That is phrase for phrase pulled, it seems, from the Great Hymn to the Aten. And so everyone can look up their Psalm 104, and then you can just give it a Google and look at the Great Hymn to the Aten and look at how similar these elements are. It is quite shocking to see that. So right there, you're like, okay, so we know there is a cultural memory of what Akhenaten did, seen in a positive light in some places, carefully kept hundreds of years after its creation in the 14th century, you guys.
Mm-hmm.
The 14th century, right? And then you're maintaining that very carefully for hundreds of years, half a century, half a millennium, until you can blow some oxygen onto this fire and let it, when it is useful, let it catch again. But it seems there are people who, even when this religion was expunged by the elites who took over after Akhenaten, we have to talk about that, of course, there were political elements that maintained it. And then the other thing that I will say is that this system of centralizing religion and centralizing power and destabilizing your elite by doing so is useful anywhere. And so whether the Israelites, as I suppose I could call them, or the people of the mountains of the Levant, if I'm going to be very broad, if these people, I doubt they had a cultural memory or a cynical cultural memory that this is what Akhenaten did and this is going to work for us, because people don't think that way. But if they've maintained this kind of connection to a cult of one God, and then start using it, and it works for them to build power as a priesthood vis-a-vis the king in a particular cult, then they're going to push that farther. Even when the kings don't want to move towards a monotheism, it doesn't serve them in terms of their political leadership, but it serves the cult. It serves the Yahweh cult. And so there's going to be this movement towards there is only one God, there's only Yahweh, that's it. And you get this competitive religious understanding, which is something that the world didn't do until that point. I mean, you could say, yes, Assyrians would invade a place, or Sargon of Akkad before that would invade a place, and he would take the statue of the god and say, your God is now mine. That's what would happen. It would be like, your God is mine. Your God lives with me now. Ha ha. And I control it. But you take that a step further and you say, your God doesn't exist. Your God is, or your God is aberrant, is wrong. And my God is the only one that is correct and right. That takes it another step further, and you gain extraordinary power in so doing. And I would say that I think people figured that out twice. They figured that out over, but these places are super close together, and they don't have the boundaries that we have between Gaza and Egypt with all these men with guns standing there. You could move back and forth across these boundaries, and people did, and they did so frequently. And there was all kinds of knowledge going back and forth across these places. And there were people that were hybrids, that were part Egyptian and part Levantine, however you want to understand that, and who maintained this religious system and then brought it to this place in some ways. I think it is the case.
And not only were they migrating, but they were in open communication, right?
Yeah,
we have this body of text, these letters, where these city states were appealing to the pharaoh and saying, hey, help us. By the way, it happens to be during the period of the judges, but we won't talk about that, the supposed period of the judges, right? But they're appealing to the pharaoh for help, and the pharaoh is saying, we're going to do this, but here's what you need to do for me. And they're communicating back and forth to Egypt. So by the way, when we put a pick in the ground, we're digging up these scarabs. We're digging up these, things with ankhs on them. So we know that there was communication between Egypt and between, the Israelites, the people living in this region at the time, all the way down through the late Bronze Age. And
for your listeners who don't know, you should look up the Amarna letters, Amarna, which is the site they were found at, Amarna in Middle Egypt. This is the new capital that Akhenaten moved everyone to, willingly or unwillingly. And at this site was found an archive of hundreds of letters from places as far away as Mesopotamia, which gives you an idea that the Levant is like next door. It's right there. It's like I can get there with, a week or so down the Nile, and then, another couple of weeks walking. This is an easy journey in comparison to getting all the way to Mesopotamia. And yet you have the king from Mesopotamia going, dude, you're making my courtier stand out in the sun all day. If you want to do that, and I'm paraphrasing, and people argue about that, this particular letter. So you can argue about it too. That's fine. But let me paraphrase in a way that serves me for this podcast, which is, you're making my people stand out in the sun all day. You do you. this is really batshit crazy, but you do you, and we're going to not participate in this, and don't make my men do this. They're complaining. Right. So they're seeing weirdness and strangeness too, which is really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. But I want to point out to our viewers, for those, we talk on this channel a lot about the problems with this conquest, the conquest of ancient Israel, and, problems with the lack of evidence for the Exodus, and the period that is supposedly in the Bible of the Judges, right, leading up to, is also this period that is when we actually have evidence of the Amarna tablets, right? The 14th century, when you've got these, we know their names, Abdecheba in Jerusalem, right? We've got the name of the guy, and he's writing a letter to the Pharaoh in Egypt saying, send help, right? Yeah. You've got all of these different cities, city-states, whatever, in Canaan saying, hey, could you send us help against this other guy? Not knowing that the Pharaoh's communicating with the other guy, helping him to, so we've got the evidence of who was actually running this place, the influence of the Pharaohs there. And we've got this corpus. So again, I do encourage all the readers, look up the Amarna letters, look at the dating of these Amarna letters, and then go back and look at, the supposed dates of the conquest and when the judges would have been in. And you can see why so many scholars, again, with all the archaeology as well, have a problem with the conquest narrative of, from Israel. But it goes back to, they were allies, especially in southern Judah. They were very close to ancient Egypt.
And what you're touching on and skirting around is this whole problem of saying that something that we identify as a divine invention in the Levantine homeland as something that could have been influenced by an Egyptian religion, which is highly problematic for true believers, which then has a whole set of dominoes falling. Because if you say that Hebrew monotheism is influenced and comes in part from Egypt, then you are devaluing Hebrew monotheism. You were talking about diffusion. You're saying that it's, somebody else thought of it first. And so people then come in and they say, oh, but Akhenaten's religion wasn't truly monotheistic because it's not the monotheism that we see in the Levant, and thus it can't be. And so you have people backpedaling and saying, no, can't be this, nothing to see here. But when you look at Akhenaten's religion, you look at his hymn to the Aten, he says, you are alone. You are the sole God. And he doesn't put too fine a point on it. He's banging a hammer on this and saying, you are the only God. And then we're dissembling, going, oh, but it's not really monotheism because, he was the son of the Aten and he's the representative. And he then calls it Ra, and Ra is another word for son. And we have all kinds of ways of getting out of this sticky situation. And I don't know about you guys, but I grew up Roman Catholic. And wow, do we have some polytheism at work in this religious cult, right? So you have the Virgin Mary and you have Jesus, the Son of God, and you can have monotheism with many manifestations of that one divinity, right? And that seems to be partly what Akhenaten was doing with his own body, with his wife's body, the great royal wife Nefertiti. But it's such an interesting thing that we say, oh no, Akhenaten's religion is not monotheism because it's not the monotheism we want it to be. And so we're so conditioned by our own baggage and our own cultural memories and the weight and power of our own religions that we can't actually look at this connection in a clear-eyed way without people coming at us. It's too hot. It is touching the third rail, and people really do lose their minds.
And yet, if you do go back and look at the work of Thomas Romer, or if you look at Mark Smith, and you see, the invention of God, or these in ancient Israel, and these different deities that were basically harmonized, right? Were incorporated into the concept of Yahweh. And then even after Hezekiah, you've got, one of the things that, that you have later on in these reforms is they're taking Asherah, they're taking out of the temple. So even after this monotheistic reform, they've still got in the Bible, by the way, it's the Bible that says this, that they're taking these poles, out of the Jerusalem temple. So they were still a polytheistic. They weren't supposed to be, according to the text, but they were still worshiping these deities. And you've got this going on in Egypt as well.
Of course.
Official religion was supposed to be one, but the people, it's, again, as you said, the Pharaoh dictates what the Pharaoh wants, but it's hard to overcome this social history.
Yeah. And what we have is Great Hymn to the Aten in tombs of the king's closest lieutenants, his elites who have followed him to this place. Does that mean that that's what's actually being practiced in the city of Amarna or in Heliopolis or in Thebes for that matter? Certainly not. But that's the way we as Egyptologists often look at these situations. We are so king-centric in our historical narrativization that we push everything into the king says this is the case and thus it must be so, rather than seeing an Egypt in the time of Akhenaten that's really in a state of soft or cold civil war, you could say, where people are working on the outside against this king as best they can during the 17 years that he's on the throne. And then as soon as he dies or is eliminated, because we have no idea, this dynasty is quickly controlled. And there is a combat, a political combat for power of who gets control after it. Because, and we've skipped a lot of what, we can go back, but like, what is Amarna like? What are the temples like that he built? All of these things are very interesting. But when he dies, there is a power vacuum that is quickly occupied by the very same military men who he elevated in power. And so he created a monster that Egypt could then not put back, or the genie could not be put back into the bottle. Yeah. The monster could not be made undead again, right? So we have problems. And you've got who is was a loyal lieutenant to Akhenaten, then being the puppet master of the boy king Tutankhamun, right? And then when Tutankhamun is dead, you move any of that lineage aside, and you have Horemheb, a general, almost certainly during the reign of Akhenaten, taking over. And then the 19th dynasty is mercenary guys. It's a bunch of generals who are coming into power, and they're from the Levant, I might point out. They are Eastern Delta guys. So they are men who situate themselves as more Egyptian than Egyptian, because they're not Egyptian in origin. They're East Delta Levantine family stock, if you like. And so the dominoes that fell with Akhenaten's attempt to consolidate power into one person, into himself, then really end up devaluing the institution of kingship over the long term and making kingship much more about violent force and military institutions of practice than anything else. So I love looking at long-term versus short-term. This is what he's trying to do, works for his reign, and then long-term, look at what you've created. Right. And you can do the same, obviously, for the creation of monotheism and the Yahweh cult. And this is what you want to do short-term. Okay, now look at long-term, what you've created. Right. And it's really interesting to see it that way.
Long-term, as this power dynamic changes, why is it that no one else can step in to maintain that? You would centralize, look at this power that you got, that it shifts back away from that, because it seems to present that individual with so much control. Was it something unique about the individual or the dynamic of the change that just wouldn't be allowed to continue again when those priests have the chance to get power back? Or is there something else that leads it to collapsing?
It's such an interesting thing, isn't it? I mean, it makes you think of Mao's Great Revolution. It makes you the Cultural Revolution. It makes you think of fallen capitals that didn't succeed. It makes you think of Louis XIV building Versailles, and 2 generations later, it all falls apart, right? That when you make these big shifts, you make yourself vulnerable over the long term. And there's so much building to be done, so much shifting of influence and money to be done, that you must delegate your power, and you must delegate power to new people who are not keyed into the old systems. And when you do that, you are giving away massive amounts of power to people who are now opportunists and operators for their own self. They're going to take it for themselves. So you are creating a monster that will come and kill you in turn. And, looking at Akhenaten's situation, let me just give one example that's interesting. There have been graveyards of the workers of Amarna uncovered, one of adults and one of children, that show mass maltreatment, malnutrition, all kinds of injuries, people working wounded, working malnourished. They're the bodies of people who are in gulag type conditions. And there's one graveyard of children separated from adults. So it smacks of extraordinary cruelty to get a capital city built as quickly as possible. And that kind of cruelty will build a capital city fast, but it will do so under short-term conditions that people will rebel against, and it's not going to have long-term health. It's a very difficult, and we could talk about Washington, D.C. and the misuse of Black Americans and how their bodies are in the bottom of the Pentagon, but they're not, they were so sidelined and marginalized in American society that it was easy to overlook them. These are Egyptians who, and I'm not saying that Black Americans weren't Americans. Please don't misunderstand me. I'm just talking about the societal hierarchies of power. And these Egyptian people, I have to assume in capital cities like Memphis and Heliopolis and Thebes, that these things happened there too, in some way, that there was an abuse of power. And when you have a king who comes in who's like, I just need it done, I need it done quickly. Think of your emperor coming in to Darth Vader. I need the Death Star yesterday, right? You're going to empower people to abuse their power, to enrich themselves and abuse their power. And that system is unsustainable, and it will be rebelled against. Maybe not in one generation, maybe in two. In Egypt, it happened super fast, such that even Nefertiti, who was a co-king, she's co-king alongside her husband. Even she can't hold this system together, this new cult, this new capital, all of these new things that they have built. And she only rules for 1 year, and I believe she was eliminated. I don't have proof for it. Most eliminations at the top are not going to be like, ha, I killed the king. Right. We can't expect it. But she rules for such a short period of time at this very vulnerable moment. And then you see the power move to the opportunists very quickly. So it's just normal people doing normal things, normal people in a moment of great vulnerability when you're stretching the cord too thin. You're spreading too much butter over the bread to use a Tolkien reference. And it's not going to work long term.
Long term, in trying to understand the legacy, as the listener is coming and thinking, it feels like he's got his fingers in a lot of different things. And there's the short term, that long term there, and then the long term for us. How would you frame Akhenaten's legacy in the long term within the Egyptian context? And then maybe the long term for the academic looking back? What are the two? Are they the same? Or is there a difference in how he is remembered and understood and his influence is framed in those positions?
I would say he is still very much remembered as a heretic. He is still very much remembered as the one who did wrong, and the one who overstepped, the one who pushed too hard. And it's an interesting thing. So I'm talking about the opportunists taking control, but when the system starts to unsustainably cave in on itself, what usually happens, and I think we see this around the world in our own American society, globally, the people in power double down. They double down with harsher restrictions. Oh, you think that's a problem? Well, now we're going to restrict this and we're going to restrict that. And we see it in our own American universities. I could talk about UCLA, but we won't do that. But as they double down and they start to put out more provisos and more recommendations or more things that one must do to behave, it creates more pushback. And in Akhenaten's case, he sent out, in the later part of his reign, he sent out men to destroy in temples all around Egypt the word gods, the name of the god Amen, statues of the god Amen, anything that he thought was competing with his religion. He sent men out with their chisels and sledgehammers to destroy. And you can imagine that he probably around the same time, if not earlier, had already sent out these same men to take the cult statues of the god Ptah and all of the ritual equipment made of gold and electrum and silver and beautiful things and jewels, and taken it all. Think of Henry VIII and his dissolution of the monasteries, right? Where does all that wealth go? Who gets it? He's pulling it to the capital. His opportunists are saying, my Lord, we have gotten this and that, but I guarantee you they're keeping some things behind, right? And so
a couple things get left in the pocket.
A couple things get left behind. So this mass destabilization event is about money and power and doubling down on the religious aspects of it, saying, no, you're wrong, you're a heretic. And then this then blows back into Akhenaten's face as his legacy, right? Because what you have then thereafter, it's such an interesting thing. Opportunists are going to opportunize. This is what they're going to do. So when they get power a couple of generations later, even though they directly benefit from what Akhenaten did, empowering them, they then go back and say, oh, but this religion, we should never have followed this. He was a heretic and he did all of these things. And then they blame it all. They centralize the sin onto this one man and his family, his lineage, so that they can then inherit the whole show and become kings like Ramses the first and Seti the first and Ramses the second in that lineage, and create a whole. And of course, Ai and Horemheb did this before them in the 18th dynasty, as we call it, and demonize this one man, even though they directly benefited from it. So they then quickly turn and say, we never wanted this religion. This wasn't something that we wanted. And you have the Tutankhamun restoration stela, right? Which I, as an advisor, almost certainly helped this boy king of 9, 10, 11 years of age come up with. He's not doing this himself. So there's such an interesting way of using the ideology then against the one who created the ideology, saying, I would never have a part of this. They changed their names, these men, Ai, Horemheb, so that we can hardly recognize them in the Akhenaten regime as was in our archaeological perusals. But they're there. And then they melt into the old traditional lineage and say how they were always these traditionalists. And then you get people who are more pious than pious. And Akhenaten will always be remembered as the one who overstepped the boundaries, who harmed Egypt, who rent Egypt in two, and that everyone had to save Egypt from his great atrocities, even though the ones who ruled after were the ones who directly benefited. Such an interesting time period.
I cannot help but draw, and pardon me, but I cannot help but draw parallels to certain individuals who stood up and said, this person is to blame for certain riots on the Capitol steps. And then all of a sudden they're like, oh, he's not going away. Well, maybe that wasn't a riot. Maybe that was just a tour visiting the Capitol steps. But the second this individual goes away, they're going to say, I helped. I always stood against him. I helped to get rid of what you're describing. I think there's
you could do it with Biden too. This old man exactly who held on to power too long, and he shouldn't have done it, and he's selfish, wanting to keep this power. And then they're taking exactly the same administration, the same tired administration, but they're going to then claim the new lieutenants who are now in charge. Oh, he did all of this wrong, and we're now creating a new start. It's not a new start. New. At all.
No, it's hard to get old machines to produce something new, but it's the same people who were there saying, no, he's great. I talk to him every day. And then these guys are the ones who said, no, we need something new. The people in the infrastructure, that is always going to be opportunistic. There's a verse somewhere that says something about there's nothing new under the sun. And I think it's one of the truisms, regardless of religion, it's one of the truisms. When it comes to politics, when it comes to power, the technologies change, but the truth is the same.
It is a very dangerous thing to decapitate all of your elites, because your elites, think of old money. When you think of the phrase old money, you think of people who wear understated but very nice clothes. Maybe they don't go shopping that much because they're not ostentatious. They live in the same house. If you go into the house, people are like, oh, it's actually kind of falling down. How interesting. They have rules they need to follow. They have weird little rituals of tea at 4 or whatever. Mm-hmm. But old money, they actually send their children to horrible boarding schools. I'm thinking of British old money, obviously. But they send their children to boarding schools where they're actually physically and mentally abused so that they fit into this system of knowing where their place is and that they are a small cog in a very long lineage that they do not get to break. Old money keeps traditions of power going over the long term. And the people who are part of those elite families, they may not know it exactly, but they know they must replicate themselves in their children in some way. When you sweep those old families aside and you replace them quickly in a Zimbabwe kind of way, with a whole bunch of new money, new influencers, new people who don't understand the rules and are just like, oh my God, those people kept my money from me. I'm going to use it. And you get such a destabilizing event that socially it blows everything up. And in Egypt, at least, it made people turn towards larger institutions. So where Egypt before had arguably been institutions and these elite families that kept the balance of power between king and what needed to happen on the ground. Once you move into the end of the 18th into the 19th dynasty, certainly with Horemheb, you get these military communities of practice and temple communities of practice. The institution takes over, and you now have the corporate run ancient Egypt. It is corporate ancient Egypt. And you can move through the corporate space and go from being a stable boy to being the chief priest of Amun-Re at Karnak. It can't happen now. But it changed Egypt elementally in its social structure. And it's this one guy who's like, I want to have all the power. I should have all the power, and I'm going to make it happen, who just created these, set up the dominoes, and then they fell one after another until you get Ramses the Great. And we shouldn't call him the Great. He's just Ramses II.
Yeah. Most the greats shouldn't be called the Great.
No, they really shouldn't. They really shouldn't. Alexander of Macedon.
Yeah, there he is.
Yes.
There he is.
Well, as we wrap up here, I want to ask, we've covered a lot, but there's a lot that we also haven't touched. If there's something you would identify as the most common misconception that you hear about people with Akhenaten, that's either the thing they get wrong or the thing you would want to reinforce from what you covered today to help how they should think about. And it might be that maybe Akhenaten isn't the great. What would you say is that central misconception about how he's remembered that people should think about?
I think that we need to not look at him through a lens of religiosity, because that's just the way we approach him, or a lens of visuality, because his body is so shocking that it just draws our gaze. It draws all of our attention, and it's all we can talk about. So when you have like all the people saying that he had this syndrome or that syndrome, rather than trying to understand what he was communicating with his body and how he was going for a shock and awe with that new marketing, right? I would like to think of Akhenaten's body as a kind of marketing rather than as a religious thing. And I think we also need to stop thinking of this time period as just one man. It's a larger social system that one person can only do so much. And I'm not saying that Akhenaten didn't go out and yell charge and say, we're going to now all become Aten worshipers and you're going to do what I say. He arguably very much did, but he had very loyal minions going along with him on this journey, and they benefited in real ways. So I like to think of it in terms of systems, that what he was trying to do was to break down one system and create another. And then third, I would say that you can't look at Akhenaten as a 17-year blip. You have to look at it over the long term. You have to look at what Amenhotep III did before. Then you've got Akhenaten's reign. And then you have to look at the 100 years after and what it was that it ended up creating. And I'm not saying Egyptologists don't do this. Jan Osman is brilliant at looking at the Long Durée into the Ramesside period and seeing what Akhenaten's destabilization did create. But a lot of Egyptologists are like, okay, and then, Akhenaten gone, it's done. No, it's not. You actually have a set of new men who will always be looking and saying, where's mine? We had it before. You better give it to me. Where's mine? And the king now has to give to the new men in a way that he did not before. It creates a populism in Egypt that was not there before. And yeah, think long term. Think long term, and then you can see history better. It's the same with now. We know we're in a time of extraordinary destabilization, and we blame it on a Trump, or we blame it on a Biden, or we blame it on Harris, whatever. These single people are just cogs in a much larger set of systems. And if you look at the human systems, when they become unsustainable, when they don't get a return on their investment, that's when they start to crumble. And opportunists step in and try to use those systems in different ways. We are now watching our systems crumble. There happen to be leaders at the forefront of those systems that we can say it's them, but it's not. It's just unsustainable systems. And that's the way we need to look at all of history. It's just Akhenaten's too sexy. You can't look away. It's hard. It's hard.
You lock eyes with that statue, it's hard to break eye contact. It is. I mean, it pulls you in its attractor beam. Absolutely.
It really does. It really does. Yeah.
Well, Dr. Kara Cooney, thank you so much for taking the time to walk through some of Akhenaten here. And as Bob mentioned at the beginning, if you're looking for more, helpfully, they've written a book that has a chapter dedicated to this. We'll put a link down in the description to the Good Kings. You can go buy that, take a read. It's definitely worth your time. But thank you for taking the time today. For all of us here at Bible and Archaeology, I'm Jordan Jones. Thanks for tuning in. We look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you, Kara.
Thank you, guys. Thanks so much.